Well, thank you all for coming here today. As was pointed out, an inauspicious date of Friday the 13th. But it's not inauspicious for me. This is actually one of the best days of my life since my son's birthday, his 21st birthday. And so hopefully this perhaps can also be a new birth for preparedness of the United States against the greatest and yet least understood threat to its existence, which is the EMP threat, which is part of cyber warfare operations, cyber warfare planning, as by the North Koreans, the Russians, the Iranians, is understood by our enemies, but is not incorporated into our own cybersecurity doctrine, which tends to focus exclusively on computer viruses and bugs. And moreover, the EMP is a natural threat as well. Now, there are many threats to the grid. I mentioned cyber, computer viruses, hacking, which is one of the things we're most concerned about. Even been TV documentaries made about it. Sabotage, such as we had out at the Medcalf transformer substation outside of San Jose, California, which took a year of basically leaking to the press before people found out about it, which increasingly the evidence looks like might have been some kind of a terrorist event, because it was clearly professionally planned. And the doctrine of the severe weather, obviously another threat, or hurricanes, tornadoes, and the like. And this is what we typically, ice and snowstorms, these are things that typically create blackouts. The worst of these, though, and all of these tend to have in common, are threats to parts of the grid, common threats to parts of the grid, which are things like extra high voltage transformers and SCADA systems. These are the things that can really go wrong. And if you are protected against the worst threat of all, which is a nuclear EMP attack, it mitigates all the rest of these as well. So this least understood threat, if you're protected against it, it basically greatly enhances your security against everything else. Now, what is an EMP? An electromagnetic pulse, is basically a super energetic radio wave, that has so much energy in it that can destroy electronics, microelectronics, the HV transformers that I described before, and SCADA systems. How is an EMP caused? Well, if you understand how your lawnmower starts, you can understand an EMP. And I'm basically going to spare you the extremely, I'll put this up just as background. This is not my briefing. Anyway, that's Cindy Ayers' briefing. When you pull, an EMP is caused by a moving magnetic field. A magnetic field in motion will generate a current in a wire, And when you pull the cord in your lawnmower, for example, let's think about how your lawnmower works. You're basically spinning a cluster of magnets called a magneto, which starts a moving magnetic field. This will generate a current in a wire that manifests itself as a spark in your spark plug. So you've made a small EMP. Now, wonders of modern technology, we don't need an EMP to disrupt it, apparently. The Earth is a giant magnet. It's got a north and a south pole, and it's surrounded by a magnetosphere, a magnetic field. And when the sun puts out a coronal mass ejection that strikes the Earth's magnetosphere, it causes it to wobble around and move back and forth. And this generates an electric current, a natural EMP, that propagates down through the atmosphere and causes powerful currents that can destroy electric grids and major components. Now, geomagnetic storms routinely happen every year, mostly in countries in high northern latitudes. But every now and again, you get a particularly powerful geomagnetic storm that will come down into our latitudes. Like in 1989, it was the Hydro-Quebec storm, which blacked out half of Canada in 92 seconds and caused billions of dollars in economic losses. In 1921, there was a geomagnetic storm called the Railroad Storm. Now, this was before the United States had become largely electrified. It didn't happen until the Roosevelt administration. But the National Academy of Sciences estimates that if the Railroad Storm happened today, it could plunge America into a blackout that would last 5 to 10 years because it would cause so much damage to the grid. And that's not the worst thing to worry about. The real big one that we're most worried about when it comes to nature is called the Carrington-class geomagnetic storm. That's the most powerful geomagnetic storm we know of, and it happened in 1859. Just when we were, electricity was in its infancy and starting to play an important role in communications. It wasn't fundamental to society, of course, in those horse and buggy days, But back in those days, we did have telegraph systems around the world, and the transatlantic cable had just been laid. And I want to pass around to you an example of 1859 technology. This is a telegraph key from about that period. And I'd just like you to try to click it, and just look at how robust that is. It's made of really heavy metal parts. And think of how much more robust and resistant to damage something like that would be compared to the microchip technology that we have in our modern computer systems. That's probably about 1 billion times less susceptible to damage from EMP than our modern electronics. And yet, all over the world, as a result of the 1859 Carrington event, telegraph stations caught on fire. Telegraph keys worked all on their own. Some of them melted. We had telegraph cables, big, thick things, that burst into flame, causing forest fires all over the world. A picture's worth 1,000 words, so I'm going to pass around this book so you can see what I'm talking about. Up until a few years ago, it was kind of controversial about, well, just how often does a Carrington event happen? But we put up satellites, and now we can photograph Carrington class, solar coronal mass ejections, and CMEs of all sorts. And we know they happen all the time. And here's one that happened back in December of 2012 when we were entering the solar maximum. And to give you an idea of the scale, this little blue dot on the side is the Earth relative to the size of the Carrington class geomagnetic storm. They're much larger than the Earth. They travel at 1 million miles an hour or more. And so one of those things comes slamming into our magnetosphere. You don't have to be an astrophysicist to understand it. You can ruin your whole day. Now, what about the nuclear EMP? That's another kind of an EMP that we're extremely concerned about. And a nuclear EMP basically does the same thing that a natural EMP does, or it can. You blow off the bomb in the magnetosphere high above the atmosphere, so there's no blast effects down on the ground. There's no that radioactive fallout. You don't hear any noise. You might not even know on a cloudy day that the bomb has been detonated. The only thing that happens is the EMP, we call it the E3, same kind of thing that is generated by the sun, except the nuclear EMP that is E3 can be much more powerful than that. Moreover, there's something else that a nuclear weapon does in EMP that isn't done in nature. That's what we call the E1 EMP. It's a little more complicated. It knocks electrons off of oxygen molecules high in the atmosphere. And these rapidly spin around, the Earth's lines of geomagnetic force at the speed of light. So you've got a very fast-moving geomagnetic field now. And so proportionally, you also have an extremely fast-moving, very powerful EMP that propagates in a nanosecond. And it can put out, well, in the case of a weapon specially designed for an EMP attack, like a super EMP weapon, 200 kilovolts per meter. That's 200,000 volts for every meter of length of the target. So if you've got a line, a cord that's 1 meter long, it gets 200,000 volts. If it's 2 meters long, it gets 400,000 volts. So multiply the length of your car by 200,000, and that's the amount of energy that's being injected within a nanosecond by this E1 electromagnetic shockwave. And it's the worst of the EMP threats. It's the worst of the EMP threats in terms of its intensity, because it can do things like damage cars, damage personal computers, and small objects. Whereas the E3, it needs larger antennas to connect it. It won't directly couple into your car, the E3. It will couple into some very large airliners. Well, most airliners would probably not be affected by the E3, but they would all be captured by the E1. And you could immediately lose 500,000 people. Because 500,000 people at any given moment are in transit in airliners over the skies of the United States, and about 1,200 airliners. Met most or all of these could come crashing to the ground after effects of a late super EMP. There's a third kind of an EMP that is of concern to us as well, but it's not a kind of EMP, but a mode of attack. Less worrisome than the other two that we've been talking about, and that is the non-nuclear EMP that can be caused by radio frequency weapons. We've arrived at a place now where you can build crude weapons. You can take a microwave oven, actually, and modify it in such a way so that it can be a simple, crude EMP weapon. You can make more sophisticated weapons using parts from Radio Shack, using unclassified design information that's available on the internet. We did an experiment in Congress where we did exactly that. We hired a guy who had a master's degree in electrical engineering, gave him a couple of students, and a little money. And in a year, they built 2 radio frequency weapons. One was designed to fit inside of a Volkswagen bus. And the idea was you could drive it down Wall Street, fry all the computers on Wall Street, cause an economic crisis. The other one was designed to fit in a shipping container for a Xerox machine. And this was before 9/11. The idea here was you could mail this to the Pentagon. It would sit in the Pentagon mail room. probably for weeks, the way the Pentagon is, and slowly fried the Pentagon computers. Now you can actually buy devices called EMP simulators. They're not intended as weapons, and you don't even need a license to buy these things. They're used by industry for looking at electromagnetic transients so that they can make sure their equipment won't self-destruct. You know, when you have large electrical machinery operating around each other. But these could be used as a weapon. And if you took one of these new EMP briefcases and put it in the trunk of the car, parked it outside of a transformer substation, you know, basically a terrorist, a criminal, a madman, a single individual with one of these things could topple the technological pillars of civilization for a major metropolitan area. So that's a third concern we have. Now the reason for this concern, let me talk a little bit about the points of vulnerability. I've mentioned these EHV transformers. And this expert group, I think most of the audience knows what those are, but some may not. Most people have never heard of these things, but they are the technological foundation of our modern civilization. They are, to our society, what roads and aqueducts were to the Roman Empire and made them a great civilization. You know, they were invented in this country by Nikola Tesla at the turn of the century, and the first electric grid deployed it, built in near Niagara Falls. And what it does, it enables you to take the energy from a hydroelectric dam, for example, or a nuclear power plant, and project it, you know, hundreds of miles down to another EHV transformer outside of a major metropolitan area, and step the energy down so it can be used locally. It is what makes the electric grid work. It makes electronic civilization possible, and we are an electronic civilization. You know, we cannot survive without electricity. It is the keystone of critical infrastructure. All the other critical infrastructures depend upon it. It will not work without electricity. You know, transportation, communications, banking and finance, even food and water depend directly or indirectly upon electricity. Another key technology that's key to our electronic civilization are SCADA systems, supervisory control and data acquisition systems. When I was growing up in the 1970s, you know, we had hundreds of thousands of blue-collar workers in this country who understood the grid, how all the critical infrastructures, utility, communication systems, and the like. And their jobs, you know, might be to basically be in a control command center and watch a gauge and make sure the electricity is going into a transformer, always the same way, always the same way, or the water is flowing through a pipe, or gas through a pipe, always in the same way. And that's basically what they did. But they also knew how to repair it if something went wrong. And because they're human beings, they could be creative. Now all of those workers are gone, and you can run a whole city with a dozen people because of these SCADAs. They're little computers that replace this workforce everywhere. And they have increased efficiency, and they've lowered costs, but they've also made us extremely vulnerable to EMP, because they are extremely vulnerable to EMP, because they're very sensitive computerized systems. And the better they get, the smaller and faster our electronics become, and SCADAs and everything else, the more vulnerable they become too. You know, there's a direct correlation between the efficiency and the speed of our increasingly improving technology that makes our electronic civilization more and more prosperous, and how vulnerable we are to it. You know, back in the 1960s, when we were relying on vacuum tube technology, that experienced catastrophic failure when we first learned about the nuclear EMP phenomenon from the Starfish Prime test. You know, more than 1,000 kilometers from the test, you know, there were electronics, vacuum tube air electronics that were destroyed, you know, by the field that were just on the edge of the EMP field, not at the core, at the center of it. Well, the modern technology today that has advanced far beyond that is over 10 million times more vulnerable than those vacuum tubes, and is getting more vulnerable all the time. So it's sort of a catch-22, you know, where the more efficient we get, and the better we get with our electronics, the more and more this becomes an Achilles heel for our society. And I would just like to point out as well that you know, this is not a view that is my own view. It's not limited to my view. This is the official view of the Congressional EMP Commission. We actually have that up, on which I serve. You know, that was headed up by the foremost EMP experts in the free world, including Dr. William Graham, a member of my task force. You know, who is probably the single greatest EMP expert in the free world, you know, and had been present in the Starfish Prime test when he was a young defense scientist, and was asked to figure out, what is this thing? What happened in Hawaii? You know, the commission on which I served, you know, looked at, well, what are the consequences? You know, what would happen if we had a protracted blackout caused by nuclear or natural EMP? as a consequence of the collapse of the critical infrastructures, the blackout lasting 1 year, our commission estimated could kill up to 9 of 10 Americans. This is not just some kind of protracted inconvenience like it had in a normal blackout. 9 of 10 Americans could be killed by this high-tech means of attacking our society the old-fashioned way, through starvation, through disease, through societal collapse. And you can see evidence of this in some of the blackouts that we have had. Look at the aftermaths of Hurricane Andrew, Hurricane Katrina. Imagine those, Hurricane Sandy. Imagine those things lasting a year across the whole country with no edge effect, no other outside states that are still well able to come in and rescue the population. It's inevitable that something like that is going to happen. You know, the reason we have a population of 310 million people today is because of our technology, because we're an electronic society. You know, if you go back, and this is one of the things our commission did, to say, well, how many people could we sustain before the electronic age? You know, if you go back to 1914, you know, we had a population of 100 million people, when 75% of the nation were farmers. You know, and we were one generation removed from pioneer stock, people who knew how to support themselves and live off the land. People don't know how to do that today. Less than 2% of the population are farmers today, and they feed the rest of us. You know, so that's just, it gives you some of the dimensions. Now the good news is, this is, in addition to this commission, I would pass this around, and if anybody wants to keep these, I have plenty. We've had 11 commissions and studies done down in Washington so far. The EMP Commission was the definitive one, but there have been studies subsequent to it, and about 11. You know, they've all come to the same conclusion. You know, the electric grid is the critical part of our society. It must be protected. The consequences will be catastrophic. Ultimately, this is a good news story in terms of the technical aspect, because there's really no excuse for our society to be vulnerable to EMP. We know how to protect against it. We've known for 50 years in the Department of Defense how to protect military systems against it. And it can be done cost effectively. You know, you can use surge arresters and Faraday cages, you know, blocking devices to protect the grid. And later, when I speak in the afternoon, I will talk in more detail about how you can actually protect an electric grid and how you can island a state electric grid so that you can protect Indiana, for example, you know, from this phenomenon. You don't have to wait for Washington to take the lead on anything, but you can and should act yourselves to protect your people here in your state. And it's not expensive to do either. You know, we estimated that you could protect the whole country, provide robust EMP protection for the whole country for $2 billion, for the whole United States, $2 billion. That's what we give away in foreign aid to Pakistan every year. Now, why haven't we done it? You know, it's because Washington is broken in this, as it is in so many other things. You know, when I've been working the EMP threat all my professional career. You know, when I was a young man working for the CIA, you know, started there back in 1985. I mean, I was assigned to work nuclear and all weapons of mass destruction, but I was also their expert on EMP. And this is the one that's always worried me the most, because you can do the most damage. You only need one nuclear weapon. One. It doesn't have to be a special weapon. Any nuclear weapon, anything the Iranians, the North Koreans, or terrorists can come up with themselves. All you have to do is get it up above 30 kilometers. And you don't even need a ballistic missile to do that, you know. You could do it with a weather balloon and loft it. And we did it ourselves when we were in the air nuclear testing, when we lofted nuclear weapons at high altitudes with weather balloons. So we could do it with a jet aircraft. Any jet aircraft that can approach Mach 1 can do a zoom climb. If the pilot's willing to sacrifice himself, you know, you could get up there to 30 kilometers and do the EMP attack. So it's not just ballistic missiles we're concerned about, but we're very concerned about that. Frank Gaffney will talk more, you know, about the actual threats that are out there, that this isn't just theoretical. But the problem, you know, with Washington is, you know, the founders, I don't think, intended a situation where you have supermajorities in Congress, you know, willing to support a bill to say, go forth, U.S. Federal Energy Regulatory Commission, and protect the nation's grid from this existential threat. They didn't intend a situation where, you know, one member of the Senate could say, well, I don't want to have that bill go forward for political reasons or something like that, so I'm going to stop it from coming up for a vote, and thereby throw it at the will of everybody else. We actually had that happen in 2010. You know, we passed the Grid Act unanimously. Think back to 2010, what polarized Congress that was. That was the year Congress changed hands. The Democrat, and it was a Democrat bill that passed that polarized Congress. It was headed by, two of the most liberal members of Congress, Henry Waxman and Mr. Markey, then a Congressman Markey, now Senator Markey, introduced this bill called the GRID Act, which was going to protect our country against the EMP threat. And everybody supported it in the House, everybody. It was co-sponsored by the most conservative members of Congress, guys like Trent Franks and Congressman Roscoe Bartlett. And it passed unanimously. And you'd think that would have counted for something when it got over to the Senate, but it didn't. There was one senator, who will remain anonymous because I still have to work with these people, but one senator put the bill on a hold, and it stopped it in 2010. If that bill had passed in 2010, I wouldn't have to be here today, because we estimate it would take about 3.5 years to protect the grid, and it's 2014 today, 4 years later. So we'd already be safe and we could be forgetting about EMP, but it didn't happen. And we've been trying ever since then to pass bills. Every year we've tried to pass the GRID Act, the SHIELD Act, which is a Republican version of the GRID Act. They're virtually identical bills. We introduced the Critical Infrastructure Protection Act. At the president's level, the White House is trying. Presidential Policy Directive 8 is aimed at this. The president has included it as a national security review. He's got some scenarios for national security that include a geomagnetic storm for the first time. Yet Washington hasn't been able to move the dime either. We haven't been able to pass the bill. Even the president hasn't been able to, basically, to compel the electric power industry or convince the electric power industry to protect the grid against EMP. We are as vulnerable today as we were back in 2001 when the EMP Commission first started examining this problem, and it spent a decade working on this problem. But it can be done at the state level. And that is the reason we're here today. And in my last briefing, I'm going to talk about how you can do it at the state level and why you should do it at the state level and should not be waiting for Washington, as we do on so many other issues, to come to the rescue. This is too important. The threat is too imminent, for us to ignore. I say imminent because, most scientists believe we're overdue for another Carrington-class geomagnetic storm. This is inevitable. It's going to happen for sure someday, 100% certainty. We just don't know when. We do know they happen about every century or so. And we know the last one in 1859 was 155 years ago. So the arithmetic obviously says we're running out of time. The National Intelligence Council that speaks for the entire U.S. intelligence community did a study in 2030 that you can look up on the internet. Most of the National Intelligence Council studies are classified. Okay, but they put this out on the internet so everybody can read it. And you can look it up. It's called Global Trends 2030. And they identify 8 black swan events that could change the course of global civilization. And one of them is the recurrence of a Carrington event by or before the year 2030. That's not that far away. That's within our lifetimes. Moreover, I think, one doesn't have to be a genius to look at how the state of the world, Russia's on the march in Europe, posing the threat to NATO, taking over Ukraine. Just yesterday, we're seeing the Middle East suddenly our defense structures collapsing everywhere there in Iran. Taliban threatening stability in Pakistan. Pakistan's a nuclear weapons state. If the Taliban get their hands on Pakistan, overnight they become a nuclear weapons power. Who do you think they might come after? Iran has been working on the bomb, for 25 years, and supposedly don't have it yet. Yet, from my own background, looking at nuclear weapons when I was at the CIA, it took the United States only 3 years to build the first 2 atomic bombs, and when nobody even knew how to do it. So I think we need to be concerned about the imminence of this, this threat, both natural and man-made, and then of course, this isn't even talking about the non-nuclear EMP weapons. There just seems to be a element of our society. Just imagine vandals. That vandal attitude. I'm not sure that it wouldn't be possible for a teenager to put together a non-nuclear EMP device. All right, and we've got enough reckless teenagers in the society that they just might want to black out New York City for a joke or something like that. Who knows? It may sound ridiculous today, but it won't sound ridiculous after it happens. And everyone will be saying, well, why didn't we harden the grid? How could we let that happen? Now, let me just, we have that up here. I'm just going to I didn't want to bore you with this long, yeah, see, it's little things like that. But, okay, that gives you a sense as the nuclear weapon rises in altitude, it gets a larger and larger field, you know. That one at 100 kilometers, you see it cover most of the East Coast. But even at 30 kilometers altitude, you'd be covering something like the entire, all the New England states, all of New York and half of Pennsylvania, if you use a weather balloon. And that's enough to collapse the eastern grid. And to be frank, the eastern grid is, let's see, do we have the eastern grid? This is data we got from our Russian friends. They actually have more knowledge about EMP than anybody in the world. You know, because they had, the evil empire did high altitude nuclear EMP tests so to their own country. You know, they exposed the country to Kazakhstan. The Russians don't like the Kazakhs. But Kazakhstan is the size of Western Europe. And they put an EMP field 5 times down over their own country, you know, to see what would happen to the critical infrastructures. And they had their scientists there. They had the whole electric grid and other critical infrastructures all wired up. They destroyed Kazakhstan, but they got the best data in the world on the effects of high altitude nuclear EMP, which they're keeping to themselves. And back in '95, when there was a thaw in the Cold War, they shared a little bit about what happened to the electric grid with us from the least efficient weapon that they tested. And it burned out transformers and destroyed generators, caused power lines to fail, all the kinds of stuff that we feared. I was in Kazakhstan a couple of weeks ago, and they're now an independent country. The reason people didn't die in Kazakhstan is the Russians were also ready to go in and repair the infrastructures, but we don't actually know whether there was not mass death in Kazakhstan, because the Soviet Union was very good at keeping secrets like that. I mean, we know that they starved 15 million Ukrainians to death during the 1920s, and it took decades for that information to get out to the world. Even the New York Times, Walter Durant was helping cover up the Ukrainian Holocaust at the time. But they know a lot more than we do about this, and apparently they are willing to share this information with the Chinese, the North Koreans, the Iranians, other bad guys. The interconnectedness of the grid, this is what happens to from naturally to an EIP transformer. The 1989 Hydro-Quebec storm, which was 1/100 was powerful, it's the 1859 Carrington event, melted the coils of a transformer that was designed to carry 500,000 volts, melted the coils in seconds. I'm sure this is familiar to most of you. This is the eastern grid, and this is the whole game. The 75% of the United States electricity is generated by the eastern grid. Now, the western grid, the Texas grid are separate and independent, and they could conceivably stand up if you took out the eastern grid, but they couldn't survive. The populations couldn't be supported if we lost the eastern grid at 75% of our national electricity. So that's all you have to do, and you can do that with a weather balloon and a nuke. Or the sun, you can do it. This is what I was talking about. This is an advertisement for a nuclear, not a nuclear, but an EMP suitcase. This is a non-nuclear EMP device made by an American manufacturer, and this is an advertisement for it. And it actually shows the field. You can get up to almost 125 kilovolts with this thing over short ranges. And you don't need a license to buy it, yet it's a weapon of mass destruction for all practical purposes. You know, you could throw this thing into the trunk of a car, as I said, black out a major metropolitan area. These are SCADAs, that's the inside, that's what a SCADA looks like. You know, it's one of these computers, and everything runs on these now. All the critical infrastructures are sustained by that. Okay, let's go to the next one. These are military writings and things like that. Oh, I'd like to, if we could hold the questions, we're going to have questions for all the panelists at the end of this. So can you play that one? Except let's see what happens. In addition to the theoretical, largely the other things that are happening, it's just useful to see the kind of threat. There we go. This is not even an EHV transformer. It's a medium-sized transformer that caught on fire, and because it got an overload, I believe the cause was it was the sun, and everybody was running their air conditioners, and there was too much strain on the system, and this thing failed. So forget about the EMP for a moment. Just having to cope with this, you know, the transformer as it burns down is itself a formidable thing. Play the other one. That this is one that happened with Hurricane Sandy, and there's sort of correlation between the magnitude of the disaster and the amount of voltage. Well, that's not it. That other one, you know, had a relatively low overvoltage. It pushed that transformer over the edge. But what happened in Hurricane Sandy, if we can end up getting that in play, is that, I mean, this is during hurricanes, tornadoes, severe weather, you get collapsed power lines and stuff, but it's not the collapsed power lines that are the biggest problem. We've got plenty of spare wire, we've got lots of telephone poles, and it takes a little time to get them back, but you know, we can replace those things. But what happens when the power lines start collapsing in a hurricane or a tornado or an ice storm is the electricity in those power lines that was there has to go somewhere. And you get an overvoltage that backs up into the transformers, into the SCADA systems, and it's kind of like an EMP, and it basically causes them to be destroyed. Now, anyway, the more severe the EMP, the more severe the burn down you can have on the EHV transformer.
You don't become a father the day you're...
There you go.
We had numerous, not EHV transformer failures, but numerous transformer failures resulting, which is one of the reasons it was so long. You know, medium-sized transformers and smaller transformers failing during Hurricane Sandy, and as have failed during Hurricane Katrina, as failed during Hurricane Andrew, and that is one of the biggest obstacles we have for bringing back the grid. There's no audio on that now. It's one of the biggest obstacles to bringing back the grid. You know, in this case, because there was a more severe overvoltage going into that transformer, you had a more severe meltdown. Typically, an EHV transformer has something like 100,000 gallons of oil in it, you know, as a coolant. And in the other case, the fire you saw was that coolant burning off. In this case, because you had such a severe overvoltage, it basically, you've got something like 500,000 volts going into it. It vaporizes the oil, and you get more of an explosion in this arcing that you see, which was witnessed basically all over New York City. Imagine the firemen that have to be called to cope with that, and to cope with the other thing. Why put them in that situation? Why not put a surge arrestor on that? A surge arrestor that can handle a nuclear EMP, and it'll handle all the rest of this too. This didn't have to happen. It didn't have to happen during Sandy, during Katrina, during Andrew. You know, we can protect against overvoltages. We can protect against the kinds of things that are caused by worst-case cyber that basically manipulates the SCADAs to cause overvoltages. And these are small potatoes compared to what a nuclear EMP would do. If you're protected against that, you're going to be protected against everything. Now, Indiana, I think you can protect, I talked about before, about $2 billion for protecting the whole country. You know, a medium-sized state like Indiana could probably be well protected for about 10 to 15 million. And we'll get into some more of the details. And there's other things that can be done, as you will see, that cost hardly anything at all, and that can probably be put in place immediately.